Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading Chapter 8 of Magician's Gambit by David Eddings, and as always, you should support the original work by buying the original book. Chapter 8. The weather continued raw and unsettled as they rode for the next 2 days up the long, sloping rise toward the snow-covered summits of the mountains. The trees became sparser and more stunted as they climbed and finally disappeared entirely. The ridgeline flattened out against the side of one of the mountains, and they rode up onto a steep slope of tumbled rock and ice where the wind scoured continually. Mr. Wolf paused to get his bearings, looking around in the pale afternoon light. "That way," he said finally, pointing. A saddleback stretched between two peaks, and the sky beyond roiled in the wind. They rode up the slope, their cloaks pulled tightly about them. Hedar came forward with a worried frown on his hawk face. "The pregnant mare's in trouble," he told Wolf. "I think her time's getting close." Without a word, Aunt Paul dropped back to look at the mare, and her face was grave when she returned. "She's no more than a few hours away, father," she reported. Wolf looked around. "There's no shelter on this side." "Maybe there'll be something on the other side of the pass," Barrack suggested, his beard whipping in the wind. Wolf shook his head. "I think it's the same as this side. We're going to have to hurry. We don't want to spend the night up here." As they rode higher, occasional spits of stinging sleet pelted them, and the wind gusted even stronger, howling among the rocks. As they crested the slope and started through the saddle, the full force of the gale struck them, driving a tattered sleet squall before it. "It's even worse on this side, Belgarath," Barrack shouted over the wind. "How far is it down to the trees?" "Miles," Wolf replied, trying to keep his flying cloak pulled around him. "The mare'll never make it," Hedar said. "We've got to find shelter." "There isn't any," Wolf stated. "Not until we get to the trees. It's all bare rock and ice up here." Without knowing why he said it, not even aware of it until he spoke, Garen made a shouted suggestion. "What about the cave?" Mr. Wolf turned and looked sharply at him. "What cave? Where?" "The one in the side of the mountain. It isn't far." Garen knew the cave was there, but he did not know how he knew. "Are you sure?" "Of course. It's this way." Garen turned his horse and rode up the slope of the saddle toward the vast craggy peak on their left. The wind tore at them as they rode, and the driving sleet half blinded them. Garen moved confidently, however. For some reason, every rock about them seemed absolutely familiar, though he could not have said why. He rode just fast enough to stay in front of the others. He knew they would ask questions, and he didn't have any answers. They rounded a shoulder of the peak and rode out onto a broad rock ledge. The ledge curved along the mountainside, disappearing in the swirling sleet ahead. "Where art thou taking us, lad?" Mandaralan shouted to him. "It's not much farther," Garen yelled back over his shoulder. The ledge narrowed as it curved around the looming granite face of the mountain, where it bent around a jutting cornice. It was hardly more than a footpath. Garen dismounted and led his horse around the cornice. The wind blasted directly into his face as he stepped around the granite outcrop, and he had to put his hand in front of his face to keep the sleet from blinding him. Walking that way, he did not see the door until it was almost within reach of his hands. The door in the face of the rock was made of iron, black and pitted with rust and age. It was broader than the gate of Falder's farm, and the upper edge of it was lost in the swirling sleet. Barrack, following close behind him, reached out and touched the iron door. Then he banged on it with his huge fist. The door echoed hollowly. "There is a cave," he said back over his shoulder to the others. "I thought that the wind had blown out the boy's senses." "How do we get inside?" Hedar shouted, the wind snatching away his words. "The door's as solid as the mountain itself," Barrack said, hammering with his fist again. "We've got to get out of the wind," Aunt Paul declared, one of her arms protectively above Sinedra's shoulders. "Well, Garion?" Mr. Wolf asked. "It's easy," Garion replied. "I just have to find the right spot." He ran his fingers over the icy iron, not knowing just what he was looking for. He found a spot that felt a little different. "Here it is!" He put his right hand on the spot and pushed slightly. With a vast grating groan, the doors began to move. A line that had not even been visible before suddenly appeared like a razor cut down the precise center of the pitted iron surface, and the flakes of rust showered from the crack to be whipped away by the wind. Geryon felt a peculiar warmth in the silvery mark on the palm of his right hand where it touched the door. Curious, he stopped pushing, but the door continued to move, swinging open. It seemed almost in response to the presence of the mark on his palm. It continued to move even after he was no longer touching it. He closed his hand, and the door stopped moving. He opened his hand, and the door, grating against stone, swung open even wider. "Don't play with it, dear," Aunt Paul told him. "Just open it." It was dark in the cave beyond the huge door, but it seemed not to have the musty smell it should have had. They entered cautiously, feeling at the floor carefully with their feet. "Just a moment," Durnik murmured in a strangely hushed voice. They heard him unbuckling one of his saddlebags, and then heard the rasp of his flint against steel. There were a few sparks and a faint glow as the smith blew on his tinder. The tinder flamed, and he set it to the torch he had pulled from his saddlebag. The torch sputtered briefly, then caught. Durnik raised it, and they all looked around at the cave. It was immediately evident that the cave was not natural. The walls and the floor were absolutely smooth, almost polished, and the light of Durnik's torch reflected back from the gleaming surfaces. The chamber was perfectly round and about 100 feet in diameter. The walls curved inward as they rose, and the ceiling high overhead seemed almost to be round. In the precise center of the floor stood a round stone table, 20 feet across with its top higher than Barrack's head. A stone bench encircled the table. In the wall directly opposite the door was a circular arch of a fireplace. The cave was cool, but it did not seem to have the bitter chill it should have had. "Is it all right to bring in the horses?" Hatter asked quietly. Mr. Wolf nodded. His expression seemed bemused in the flickering torchlight. His eyes were lost in thought. The horses' hooves clattered sharply on the smooth stone floor as they were led inside, and they looked around, their eyes wide and their ears twitching nervously. "There's a fire laid in here," Durnik said from the arched fireplace. "Shall I light it?" Wolf looked up. "What? Oh, yes, go ahead." Durnik reached into the fireplace with his torch, and the wood caught immediately. The fire swelled up very quickly, and the flames seemed inordinately bright. Sinadra gasped. "The walls! Look at the walls!" The light from the fire was somehow being refracted through the crystalline structure of the rock itself, and the entire dome began to glow with a myriad of shifting colors, filling the chamber with a soft, multi-hued radiance. Heder had moved around the circle of the wall and was peering into another arched opening. "A spring," he told them. "This is a good place to ride out a storm." Durnik put out his torch and pulled off his cloak. The chamber had become warm almost as soon as he lighted the fire. He looked at Mr. Wolf. "You know about this place, don't you?" he asked. "None of us has ever been able to find it before," the old man replied, his eyes still thoughtful. "We weren't sure it still existed." "What is this strange cave, Belgarath?" Mandaralin asked. Mr. Wolf took a deep breath. "When the gods were making the world, it was necessary for them to meet from time to time to discuss what each of them had done and was going to do, that everything would fit together and work in harmony. The mountains, the winds, the seasons, and so on." He looked around. "This is the place where they met." Silk, his nose twitching with curiosity, had climbed up onto the bench surrounding the huge table. "There are bowls up here," he said, "7 of them, and 7 cups. There seems to be some kind of fruit in the bowls." He began to reach out with one hand. "Silk!" Mr. Wolf told him sharply. "Don't touch anything!" Silk's hand froze, and he looked back over his shoulder at the old man, his face startled. "You better come down from there," Wolf said gravely. "The door!" Sinadra exclaimed. They all turned in time to see the massive iron door gently swinging closed. With an oath, Barrack leaped toward it, but he was too late. Booming hollowly, it clanged shut just before his hands reached it. The big man turned, his eyes filled with dismay. "It's all right, Barrack," Garion told him. "I can open it again." Wolf turned then and looked at Garion, his eyes questioning. "How did you know about the cave?" he asked. Garion floundered helplessly. "I don't know. I just did. I think I've known we were getting close to it for the last day or so." "Does it have anything to do with the voice that spoke to Mara?" "I don't think so. He doesn't seem to be there right now. And my knowing about the cave seemed to be different somehow. I think it came from me, not him, but I'm not sure how. For some reason, it seems that I've always known this place was here, only I didn't think about it until we started to get near it. It's awfully hard to explain it exactly." Aunt Paul and Mr. Wolf exchanged a long glance. Wolf looked as if he were about to ask another question, but just then there was a groan at the far end of the chamber. "Somebody help me!" Hedda called urgently. One of the horses, her sides distended and her breath coming in short, heaving gasps, stood swaying as if her legs were about to give out from under her. Hedar stood at her side, trying to support her. "She's about to fall," he said. They all turned then, and went quickly to the laboring mare. Aunt Paul immediately took charge of the situation, giving orders crisply. They eased the mare to the floor, and Hedar and Durnik began to work with her, even as Aunt Paul filled a small pot with water and set it carefully in the fire. "I'll need some room," she told the rest of them pointedly as she opened the bag which contained her jars of herbs. "Why don't we all get out of your way?" Barrack suggested, looking uneasily at the gasping horse. "Splendid idea," she agreed. "Sinedra, you stay here. I'll need your help." Garion, Barrack, and Mandaralin moved a few yards away and sat down, leaning back against the glowing wall, while Silk and Mr. Wolf went off to explore the rest of the chamber. As he watched, Durnik and Hedda were with the mare, and Aunt Paul and Sinedra by the fire, Garion felt strangely abstracted. The cave had drawn him, there was no question of that, and even now it was exerting some peculiar force on him. Though the situation with the mare was immediate, he seemed unable to focus on it. He had a strange certainty that finding the cave was only the first part of whatever it was that was happening. There was something else he had to do, and his abstraction was in some way of preparation for it. "It is not an easy thing to confess," Mandaralin was saying somberly. Garion glanced at him. "In view of the desperate nature of our quest, however," the knight continued, "I must openly acknowledge my great failing. It may come to pass with this flaw of mine shall in some hour of great peril cause me to turn and flee like the coward that I am, leaving all your lives in mortal danger." "You're making too much of it," Barrack told him. "Nay, my lord, I urge you consider the matter closely to determine if I am fit to continue in our enterprise." He started to creak to his feet. "Where are you going?" Barrack asked. "I thought to go apart so that you may freely discuss this matter." "Oh, sit down, Mandaralin," Barrack said irritably. "I'm not going to say anything behind your back I wouldn't say to your face." The mare, laying close to the fire with her head cradled in Heddar's lap, groaned again. "Is that medicine almost ready, Polgara?" the Algar asked in a worried voice. "Not quite," she replied. She turned back to Sinedra, who was carefully grinding up some dried leaves in a small cup with the back of a spoon. "Break them up a little finer, dear," she instructed. Durnik was standing astride the mare, his hands on her distorted belly. "We may have to turn the foal," he said gravely. "I think it's trying to come the wrong way." "Don't start on that until this has a chance to work," Aunt Paul told him, slowly tapping a grayish powder from an earthen jar into her bubbling pot. She took the cup of leaves from Sinedra, and added that as well, stirring as she poured. "I think, my lord Barrack," Mandaralin urged, "that thou hast not fully considered the import of what I have told thee." "I heard you. You said you were afraid once. It's nothing to worry about. It happens to everybody now and then." "I cannot live with it. I live in constant apprehension, never knowing when it will return to unman me." Durnik looked up from the mare. "You're afraid of being afraid?" he asked in a puzzled voice. "You cannot know what it is like, good friend," Mandaralin replied. "Your stomach tightening up, Durnik told him. Your mouth was dry and your heart felt as if someone had his fist clamped around it. Mandaralin blinked. It's happened to me so often that I know exactly how it feels. Thou? Thou art among the bravest men I have ever known. Durnik smiled wryly. I'm an ordinary man, Mandaralin, he said. Ordinary men live in fear all the time. Didn't you know that? We're afraid of the weather. We're afraid of powerful men. We're afraid of the night and the monsters that lurk in the dark. We're afraid of growing old and of dying. Sometimes we're even afraid of living. Ordinary men are afraid almost every minute of their lives. How can you bear it? Do we have any choice? Fear is a part of life, Mandaralin, and it's the only life we have. You'll get used to it. After you've put it on every morning like an old tunic, you won't even notice it anymore. Sometimes laughing at it helps. A little. Laughing? It shows the fear that you know it's there, but that you're going to go ahead and do what you have to do anyway. Durnik looked down at his hands, carefully kneading the mare's belly. Some men curse and swear and bluster, he continued. That does the same thing, I suppose. Every man has to come up with his own technique for dealing with it. Personally, I prefer laughing. It seems more appropriate somehow. Mandaralin's face became gravely thoughtful as Durnik's words slowly sank in. I will consider this, he said. It may be, good friend, that I will owe thee more than my life for thy gentle instruction. Once more the mare groaned, a deep tearing sound, and Durnik straightened and began rolling up his sleeves. The foal's going to have to be turned, Mistress Paul, he said decisively, and soon, or we'll lose the foal and the mare both. Let me get some of this into her first, she replied, quenching her boiling pot with some cold water. Hold her head, she told Hedar. Hedar nodded and firmly wrapped his arms around the laboring mare's head. Garion, Aunt Paul said as she spooned the liquid between the mare's teeth, why don't you and Sinedra go over there where Silk and your grandfather are? Have you ever turned a foal before, Durnik? Hedar replied anxiously. Not a foal, but calves many times. A horse isn't that much different from a cow, really. Varric stood up quickly. His face had a slight greenish cast to it. I'll go with Garion and the princess, he rumbled. I don't imagine I'll be much help here. And I will join thee, Mandaralin declared. His face was also visibly pale. It were best, I think, to leave our friends ample room for their midwifery. Aunt Paul looked at the two warriors with a slight smile on her face, but said nothing. Garion and the others moved rather quickly away. Silk and Mr. Wolf were standing beyond the huge stone table, peering into another of the circular openings in the shimmering wall. I've never seen fruits exactly like those, the little man was saying. I'd be surprised if you had, Wolf replied. They look as fresh as if they'd been picked. Silk's hand moved almost involuntarily toward the tempting fruit. I wouldn't, Wolf warned. I wonder what they taste like. Wondering won't hurt you. Tasting might. I hate an unsatisfied curiosity. You'll get over it. Wolf turned to Garion and the others. How's the horse? Durnik says he's going to have to turn the foal, Varric told him. We thought it might be better if we all got out of the way. Wolf nodded. Silk, he admonished sharply, not turning around. Sorry. Silk snatched his hand back. Why don't you just get away from there? You're only going to get yourself in trouble. Silk shrugged. I do that all the time anyway. Just do it, Silk, Wolf told him firmly. I can't watch over you every minute. He slipped his fingers up under the dirty and rather ragged bandage on his arm, scratching irritably. That's enough of that, he declared. Garion, take this thing off me. He held out his arm. Garion backed away. Not me, he refused. Do you know what Aunt Paul would say to me if I did that without her permission? Don't be silly. Silk, you do it. First you say to stay out of trouble, and then you tell me to cross Polgara? You're inconsistent, Belgarath. Oh, here, Sinedra said. She took hold of the old man's arm and began picking at the knotted bandage with her tiny fingers. Just remember that this was your idea. Garion, give me your knife. Somewhat reluctantly, Garion handed over his dagger. The princess sawed through the bandage and began to unwrap it. The splints fell, clattering to the stone floor. What a dear child you are, Mr. Wolf beamed at her, and began to scratch at his arm with obvious relief. Just remember that you owe me a favor, she told him. She's a tall Nadrin, all right, Silk observed. It was about an hour later when Aunt Paul came around the table to them, her eyes somber. How's the mare? Sinadra asked quickly. Very weak, but I think she'll be all right. What about the baby horse? Aunt Paul sighed. We're too late. We tried everything, but we just couldn't get him to start breathing. Sinadra gasped, her little face suddenly a deathly white. You're not going to just give up, are you? She said it almost accusingly. There's nothing we can do, dear, Aunt Paul told her sadly. It took too long. He just didn't have enough strength left. Sinadra stared at her unbelievingly. Do something, she demanded. You're a sorceress. Do something. I'm sorry, Sinadra. That's beyond our power. We can't reach beyond that barrier. The little princess wailed then and began to cry bitterly. Aunt Paul put her arms comfortingly around her and held her as she sobbed. But Garion was already moving. With absolute clarity, he now knew what it was that the cave expected of him, and he responded without thinking, not running or even hurrying. He walked quietly around the stone table toward the fire. Hedar sat cross-legged on the floor with the unmoving colt on his lap, his head bowed with sorrow and his mane-like scalp lock falling across the spindle-shanked little animal's silent face. Give him to me, Hedar, Garion said. Garion, no! Aunt Paul's voice, coming from behind him, was alarmed. Hedar looked up, his hawk face filled with deep sadness. Let me have him, Hedar, Garion repeated very quietly. Wordlessly, Hedar raised the limp little body, still wet and glistening in the firelight, and handed it to Garion. Garion knelt and laid the foal on the floor in front of the shimmering fire. He put his hands on the tiny rib cage and pushed gently. Breathe, he almost whispered. We tried that, Garion, Hedar told him sadly. We tried everything. Garion began to gather his will. Don't do that, Garion, Aunt Paul told him firmly. It isn't possible, and you'll hurt yourself if you try. Garion was not listening to her. The cave itself was speaking to him too loudly for him to hear anything else. He focused his every thought on the wet, lifeless body of the foal. Then he stretched out his right hand and laid his palm on the unblemished, walnut-colored shoulder of the dead animal. Before him there seemed to be a blank wall, black and higher than anything else in the world, impenetrable and silent, beyond his comprehension. Tentatively he pushed at it, but it would not move. He drew in a deep breath and hurled himself entirely into the struggle. Live, he said. Garion, stop! Live, he said again, throwing himself deeper into his effort against the blackness. It's too late now, Paul, he heard Mr. Wolf say from somewhere. He's already committed himself. Live, Garion repeated, and the surge he felt welling up out of him was so vast that it drained him utterly. The glowing walls flickered and then suddenly rang as if a bell had been struck somewhere deep inside the mountain. The sound shimmered, filling the air inside the domed chamber with a vibrant ringing. The light in the wall suddenly flared with a searing brightness, and the chamber was as bright as noon. The little body under Garion's hand quivered, and the colt drew in a deep, shuddering breath. Garion heard the others gasp as the stick-like little legs began to twitch, and the colt inhaled again, and his eyes opened. A miracle, Manderolin said in a choked voice. Perhaps even more than that, Mr. Wolf replied, his eyes searching Garion's face. The colt struggled, his head wobbling weakly on his neck. He pulled his legs under him and began to struggle to his feet. Instinctively, he turned to his mother and tottered toward her to nurse. His coat, which had been in a deep, solid brown before Garion had touched him, was now marked on the shoulder with a single, incandescently white patch, exactly the size of the mark on Garion's palm. Garion lurched to his feet and stumbled away, pushing past the others. He staggered to the icy spring bubbling in the opening in the wall and splashed water over his head and neck. He knelt before the spring, shaking and breathing hard for a very long time. Then he felt a tentative, almost shy touch on his elbow. When he warily raised his head, he saw the now steadier colt standing at his side and gazing at him with adoration in his liquid eyes.